October 15, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Florence, Arizona, carrying its unusual cargo through the desert landscape. Inside, 23 German women sat in rigid silence, their faces gaunt, and their auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on frames that had grown thin during the chaotic final months of the North African campaign. They had been captured near Tunisia as Rommel's forces collapsed, serving as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel for the Afrika Korps. Now they found themselves an ocean away from everything they had known, prisoners in a land they had been taught to despise. Lieutenant Rachel Coleman stood at the camp entrance, watching the truck approach with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. She was among the first female officers assigned to oversee a women's POW facility, a role that felt as experimental as it was unprecedented. The Army hadn't quite known what to do with captured German women, so they had created this smaller compound within the larger male prisoner facility, housing fewer than 30 women in barracks that had been hastily converted from storage buildings. Rachel had received minimal guidance beyond the basic Geneva Convention protocols and a terse memo instructing her to maintain discipline while ensuring humane treatment. As the women climbed down from the truck, Rachel noticed their eyes. They held the same hollow look she had seen in photographs from the Depression, the unmistakable mark of prolonged hunger. Among them was Johanna Brenner, a 26-year-old nurse from Berlin who had joined the medical corps believing she was serving a noble cause. She clutched a small canvas bag containing everything she still owned in the world: a change of undergarments, a wooden comb with several teeth missing, and a photograph of her younger sister that had somehow survived the journey across the Atlantic. Beside Johanna stood Katharina Weber, known to everyone as Kat, a 22-year-old radio operator from Munich whose quick mind and aptitude for codes had made her valuable to the communications corps. Kat's blonde hair, once kept in regulation braids, now hung limp and tangled around her thin face. She had been surviving on quarter rations for the past 3 months, ever since their unit had been cut off from supply lines during the Allied advance. The constant gnawing in her stomach had become so familiar that she barely noticed it anymore, a dull companion to the uncertainty that filled every waking moment. Frieda Schultz, at 35, the oldest among them, moved with the deliberate care of someone conserving every ounce of energy. She had been an administrative officer, managing personnel records and supply requisitions with Germanic precision until the day everything fell apart. Young Anneliese Krauss, barely 19, and looking even younger with her round face and wide, frightened eyes, stood close to Johanna like a shadow. She had grown up on a small farm in rural Bavaria and had joined the Auxiliary Corps because the recruiter promised regular meals and an opportunity to serve the fatherland. Lieutenant Coleman began the intake process with crisp efficiency, her voice firm but not unkind as she explained the camp rules through a translator. The women would be assigned to barracks, given clean uniforms, and expected to maintain military discipline despite their prisoner status. As Rachel spoke, she watched the women's faces for signs of defiance or hostility, but found only exhaustion and a wariness that seemed to go deeper than simple fear of captivity. Sergeant Marcus Sullivan observed the intake proceedings from his position near the mess hall. A tall Texan with sun-weathered skin and hands that bore the calluses of ranch work, Mark had been assigned to supervise the kitchen operations that would now include feeding these unexpected prisoners. He had grown up on his family's cattle ranch outside San Antonio, where Sunday dinners meant a table laden with enough food to feed the entire extended family. The sight of these starving women stirred something in him that transcended national boundaries or military allegiances. Corporal Betty Walsh, a first-generation Irish-American from Massachusetts, stood ready to escort the women to their barracks. Betty's own mother had arrived in America hungry, fleeing the poverty of County Cork with nothing but hope and determination. She recognized that particular kind of hunger in these German women's eyes, the kind that went beyond missing a few meals, the kind that spoke of weeks or months of deprivation. Despite her duties as a guard, despite the fact that these women represented the enemy her brothers were fighting overseas, Betty felt an unexpected surge of compassion. The processing took nearly 2 hours. Each woman was documented, photographed, and assigned a prisoner number. Johanna became prisoner 2741. Kat became 2742. They were issued clean prison uniforms, rough cotton dresses in pale gray that at least fit better than their own tattered auxiliary uniforms. They were shown to their barracks, a long wooden building with rows of cots and thin mattresses that nonetheless seemed luxurious compared to the conditions they had endured in the overcrowded holding facilities in North Africa. As evening fell over the desert compound, the women sat on their cots in silence. They had been told that dinner would be served at 1800 hours, but none of them dared to hope for much. In the camps where they had been held before, meals had consisted of watery soup and a small piece of bread, barely enough to sustain life. Johanna sat with her hands folded in her lap, trying to calm the trembling that had nothing to do with the cooling desert evening. Beside her, young Annalise quietly wept, trying to muffle the sound in her thin pillow. When Corporal Walsh appeared at the barracks door and announced it was time for dinner. The women rose with mechanical obedience. They formed a ragged line and followed her across the compound toward the mess hall, their eyes downcast, their expectations carefully managed by months of disappointment and deprivation. None of them could have imagined what awaited them. The smell reached them first as they approached the building, a rich aroma that seemed impossible, that seemed like a cruel trick of their hungry minds. It was the smell of roasting meat, of potatoes and gravy, of food prepared with abundance rather than scarcity. Johanna's step faltered, and she saw Kat's eyes widen with confusion and disbelief. Surely, they thought, this couldn't be for them. The mess hall doors swung open, and the German women entered a space that defied everything they thought they knew about prisoner treatment. Long tables stretched across the room, already set with metal trays and utensils, but it was the serving line that stopped them in their tracks. Behind the counter stood Private Helen O'Brien, a robust woman with flour dusting her apron and a smile that seemed out of place in a prison camp. Beside her, Sergeant Sullivan presided over steaming trays of food that looked like something from a dream or a distant memory. Johanna found herself at the front of the line, her hands shaking as she held out her tray. Helen O'Brien looked at her with kind eyes and began ladling food onto the metal surface. First came a thick slice of pot roast, the meat so tender it fell apart under the serving spoon. Then came mashed potatoes, smooth and buttered, followed by carrots glazed with something sweet, green beans, a thick ladle of brown gravy that covered everything in rich, glistening abundance, and finally, a thick slice of white bread with a pat of butter. Johanna stared at the tray in her hands, as if it might vanish at any moment. This was more food than she had seen on a single plate in over a year, more meat than her entire unit had shared in a week during those final desperate months in North Africa. She looked up at Helen with confusion bordering on suspicion. Was this some kind of test? A psychological trick to soften them before interrogation? Helen simply smiled and said something in English that the translator repeated, "Sunday pot roast. It's tradition here." Behind Johanna, Kat received her portion with the same stunned disbelief. Young Annalise actually gasped when the meat was placed on her tray, her eyes filling with tears. Frida, ever the pragmatist, maintained her composure, but her hands trembled as she carried her loaded tray to a table. One by one, the 23 German women received portions that seemed impossibly generous, that contradicted everything their propaganda had told them about American cruelty and deprivation. They sat in silence, none of them quite believing what lay before them. Johanna looked around the table at her companions, seeing her own confusion reflected in their faces. This had to be a special occasion, she reasoned. Perhaps it was a holiday they didn't know about. Perhaps tomorrow they would return to the meager rations they expected. She picked up her fork with deliberate care, as if sudden movements might cause this abundance to disappear. The first bite of pot roast nearly undid her completely. The meat was tender and flavorful, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. The potatoes were creamy and rich. The gravy tasted like comfort itself. Johanna had to force herself to chew slowly, to not devour everything in desperate gulps. Around her, the other women ate with the same careful restraint, their bodies crying out for sustenance while their minds struggled to process this unexpected kindness. This wasn't how enemies were supposed to treat prisoners. This wasn't how the war was supposed to work. That night in the barracks, the women lay awake in the darkness, their stomachs full for the first time in months. The sensation was almost uncomfortable after so long with so little. Johanna stared at the ceiling, her mind refusing to settle. She kept returning to the image of that plate, the impossible abundance of it, trying to reconcile what she had experienced with everything she had been told about America. In Berlin, before she had been sent to North Africa, the ration cards had controlled every aspect of life. Her family's weekly allotment of meat had been barely enough for a single modest meal. Bread had been stretched thin, supplemented with sawdust and other fillers to make the flour last longer. Her mother had performed miracles with turnips and potatoes, creating meals that at least filled their stomachs if not their nutritional needs. Johanna remembered the constant gnawing hunger that had become normal, the way her younger sister's cheeks had grown hollow, the way everyone moved a little slower to conserve energy. Beside her, Kat whispered in the darkness, "Did that really happen? Or are we all having the same dream?" Her voice carried a tremor of uncertainty that matched what Johanna felt. Several other women murmured in agreement, their voices soft in the night air. They had learned to be cautious with hope, to not trust anything that seemed too good to be true. Frida's pragmatic voice cut through the whispers. "It happened. The question is why?" She paused, and Johanna could hear the analytical mind working through possibilities. Perhaps they're fattening us up before sending us somewhere worse. Perhaps it's propaganda, something they can photograph and show the world. Perhaps it's only for the first day. Her words gave voice to the suspicions they all harbored, the protective skepticism that came from too many disappointments. Young Annalise spoke up, her voice small and hopeful. "My grandmother used to make roast like that, before the war, on Sundays after church." The longing in her voice was palpable. "I thought I'd never taste anything like it again." She fell silent, perhaps realizing that speaking of such memories made them more painful rather than less. Johanna thought about her own grandmother's Sunday dinners, gatherings that had ended when the war began in earnest. She remembered the way her grandmother had tried to maintain traditions even as the rations grew smaller, setting the table with the good china even when there was barely anything to put on it. The old woman had died during the winter of 1943, malnutrition weakening her until a simple cold became pneumonia. Johanna had been in North Africa by then, unable to return for the funeral, learning of her grandmother's death through a letter that had taken 3 months to reach her. The memory of that pot roast mingled with memories of her grandmother's cooking, creating a confusing tangle of emotions. Gratitude mixed with guilt, relief mixed with suspicion, hope mixed with the learned caution of survival. Tomorrow would bring answers, Johanna told herself. Tomorrow they would discover whether this abundance was real or just another cruelty of war, a moment of plenty designed to make the inevitable return to hunger even more painful. Morning came with the desert sun streaming through the barracks windows. The women rose stiffly, their bodies still adjusting to the first full night's sleep many had experienced in months. Johanna helped young Annalise make her cot with military precision, a habit that provided comfort in its familiarity. They dressed in their issued prison uniforms and waited for whatever the day would bring, their stomachs no longer cramping with hunger, but their minds full of questions about what came next. Corporal Walsh arrived to escort them to breakfast. The walk across the compound felt different in daylight. Johanna could see the larger facility beyond their separate enclosure, rows of barracks housing male German prisoners who worked in the fields and workshops. She wondered if they received the same treatment, the same impossible abundance of food. Walsh's expression was neutral but not unkind as she led them back to the mess hall, offering no hints about what to expect. The smell of coffee hit them first. Real coffee. Not the bitter ersatz mixture made from roasted grains that had become standard in Germany. Then came the scent of bacon, of eggs, of bread toasting. Johanna felt Kat grip her arm tightly as they entered and saw the serving line once again laden with food. This was no special occasion, no one-time display. This was breakfast, ordinary breakfast, and it contained more protein and fat than they had seen in a week during the worst times in North Africa. Helen O'Brien stood at her post again, her cheerful demeanor unchanged. She served each woman 2 eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 2 slices of toast with butter and jam, and a portion of fried potatoes. The translator, a middle-aged man named Private Cooper, who had learned German from his immigrant grandparents, explained that coffee and milk were available at the end of the line. Johanna accepted her tray with trembling hands, no longer able to maintain the stoic mask she had worn the previous evening. At the tables, Lieutenant Coleman sat with her own breakfast, deliberately choosing to eat among the prisoners rather than in the separate officers' mess. It was a calculated decision, one she hoped would begin to build some kind of rapport with these women. She watched as they ate with more confidence than the previous night, their initial shock giving way to cautious acceptance. Through Private Cooper, she spoke to the table nearest her. "The Geneva Convention requires that we feed you the same rations as our own troops receive. This is standard breakfast. Nothing special." Frida looked up from her plate, her analytical mind processing this information. "Your troops eat like this every day?" The question carried such disbelief that Rachel almost smiled. She nodded simply, taking a bite of her own toast. "Every day. Sometimes better on Sundays and holidays." The translation rippled through the mess hall, met with silence as the German women absorbed this revelation. If this was ordinary, if this was the baseline of American military provisioning, then everything they had been told about America suffering under British blockades, about American soldiers starving in their own homeland, had been lies. After breakfast, Lieutenant Coleman announced the work assignments. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to work in non-military capacities. The women would be divided into groups for various duties: laundry, maintenance, administrative tasks, and kitchen work. Johanna, with her medical background, would assist in the small camp infirmary. Kat, with her organizational skills, would help with supply inventory. Young Annalise and several others were assigned to the kitchen under Sergeant Sullivan's supervision. Annalise followed Sullivan into the kitchen with trepidation, unsure what to expect from this tall American, with his weather-worn face and careful eyes. The kitchen was larger than she had anticipated, with industrial stoves, enormous refrigerators, and storage areas stocked with more food than she had seen in years. Sullivan gestured to the supplies, and through Private Cooper's translation, began explaining the day's tasks. They would be preparing lunch for the entire women's compound and helping with prep work for the evening meal. Sullivan noticed how Annalise's eyes kept drifting to the storage areas, to the sacks of flour and sugar, the crates of vegetables, the hanging sides of beef in the cold storage. He understood that look. It was the same expression his younger cousins had worn during the worst years of the Depression, when they had come to stay on the ranch because their family couldn't feed them in the city. It was the look of someone trying to believe that abundance was real and not just a temporary illusion. He handed Annalise a bag of potatoes and a peeler, demonstrating the task with patient gestures that needed no translation. She began working with careful precision, her farm girl hands finding familiar comfort in the simple task. 2 other German women joined them, and soon a quiet rhythm developed in the kitchen. Sullivan worked alongside them, not as an overseer but as a fellow laborer, peeling vegetables and preparing ingredients with the practiced efficiency of someone who had grown up working hard. Helen O'Brien bustled in with her characteristic energy, greeting the new kitchen helpers with a warm smile that transcended language barriers. She began teaching them the American way of preparing certain dishes, showing them how to season the pot roast that would be tomorrow's Sunday dinner, how to make the thick gravy that had so amazed them. Annalise watched with fascination as Helen added what seemed like extravagant amounts of butter and cream, ingredients that had been luxuries even before the war in her small Bavarian village. During a quiet moment, Sullivan pulled out photographs from his wallet, showing them to the German women through gestures and Cooper's occasional translations. His family's ranch, his parents, his 3 younger sisters who looked not much different from these prisoners in age and appearance. Annalise understood what he was trying to communicate without words. They were not so different, Americans and Germans. They came from farms and cities, they had families they missed, they knew the value of hard work and the comfort of shared meals. By midday, something subtle had shifted in the kitchen. The work continued, but the atmosphere had changed from wary coexistence to something approaching cooperation. Annalise found herself almost smiling as she worked, her hands busy, her stomach full, her mind beginning to question everything she thought she knew about enemies. 3 weeks into their captivity, the German women were informed they could write letters home. Lieutenant Coleman explained through Private Cooper that all correspondence would be censored according to military regulations, but they were permitted to reassure their families of their safety and well-being. The announcement brought a mixture of relief and anxiety. What could they possibly write that would be believed? Johanna sat on her cot that evening with a single piece of paper and a pencil, staring at the blank page. How could she explain to her younger sister what she had experienced? How could she describe meals that contained more meat than their entire family had seen in months? Would her sister think she had gone mad, or worse, that she had betrayed her country by accepting such treatment? The words felt impossible to form. She began carefully, keeping her tone measured and factual. "Dearest Liesel, I am writing to tell you that I am safe and well. I am being held at a prisoner facility in America, in a place called Arizona. The conditions here are adequate and we are being treated in accordance with international law." She paused, chewing on the pencil. How much more could she say without sounding like she had been compromised or coerced? Around her, other women struggled with the same dilemma. Kat wrote to her mother in Munich, trying to find words that would pass the censor but still convey the truth. "We receive regular meals. The Americans provide sufficient food." Even that simple statement felt inadequate to describe the reality of their situation. How could 3 words encompass the shock of seeing a plate laden with pot roast, the disbelief of eating eggs and bacon every morning, the strange guilt that came with being better fed as a prisoner than she had been as a soldier? Frida, ever practical, approached her letter like an official report. She listed facts, the temperature, the daily routine, the work assignments, but even she couldn't resist adding a line that might raise eyebrows among the censors. "The food provisions here exceed what we received in our own military service. The Americans appear to have no shortage of supplies." She wondered if that sentence would be blacked out, if it would be seen as propaganda or intelligence that shouldn't be shared. Young Anneliese wrote to her parents on their Bavarian farm, her handwriting careful and childlike. "Please don't worry about me. I am working in a kitchen, which reminds me of home. The Americans are not what we were told they would be. They share their food with us, even though we are their enemies. I don't understand why, but I am grateful." Tears fell on the paper as she wrote, smudging the ink slightly. She thought of her mother, trying to feed the family on dwindling rations, her father working their small farm with no sons left to help him. That night, Lieutenant Coleman reviewed the letters before they would be sent to military intelligence for final approval. She read the tentative words, the careful phrasing, the obvious struggle these women faced in describing their treatment. One phrase in Johanna's letter caught her attention: "I no longer know what to believe about anything." Rachel understood that feeling. This war had made certainties uncertain for everyone involved. November brought cooler temperatures to the Arizona desert, a relief after the scorching October heat. The women had settled into routines that no longer felt quite so foreign. They rose at 6 each morning, made their cots with military precision, and reported to their various work assignments. The initial suspicion that the abundant food was temporary had faded as week after week brought the same generous portions. But trust remained a more complicated matter. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon. Young Anneliese was working in the kitchen when she slipped on a wet patch of floor, falling hard and twisting her ankle. She cried out in pain, and Sergeant Sullivan immediately called for help. Within minutes, Johanna arrived from the infirmary with her medical kit, her training taking over before her wariness could interfere. She knelt beside Anneliese, gently examining the swelling ankle while murmuring reassurances in German. Sullivan watched the interaction with careful attention, then made a decision that went against protocol. He left the kitchen and returned moments later with a bucket of ice, something that should have required authorization from Lieutenant Coleman. He set it down beside Johanna without a word, their eyes meeting in a moment of understanding that transcended language and nationality. She nodded her thanks and began applying the ice to Anneliese's injury, her skilled hands working with the confidence of her medical training. Corporal Walsh arrived to investigate the commotion and found Sullivan helping Johanna wrap Anneliese's ankle with an elastic bandage. Betty expected to feel concern about this breach of the invisible walls that were supposed to separate guards from prisoners. Instead, she felt something else entirely. She saw 2 people working together to help a third, their respective uniforms and nationalities momentarily irrelevant in the face of human need. She made a note in her daily report but framed it in terms that wouldn't raise alarms with Captain Hayes. That evening at dinner, the incident rippled through both the prisoners and the staff. The German women had seen their American captors respond to one of their own with immediate concern and practical help. The American staff had watched their sergeant and the German nurse work together with easy cooperation. Something invisible but significant had shifted in the compound's atmosphere. The careful distance everyone had maintained began to feel less necessary, less natural. Johanna found herself sitting near Lieutenant Coleman during the meal, and Rachel took the opportunity to speak through Private Cooper. "You have medical training. We could use your help in the infirmary on a more regular basis. Would you be willing?" It was phrased as a question rather than an order, and that distinction mattered more than Rachel perhaps realized. Johanna considered the offer, weighing her response carefully. Agreeing felt like collaboration, like accepting her situation rather than merely enduring it. But refusing felt like false pride, like maintaining a fiction of resistance when the reality was far more complicated. "Yes," Johanna finally said in her careful English, "I will help." And with those simple words, she crossed an invisible line from captive to something else entirely, something that had no easy definition but felt closer to participant than prisoner. Around them, other conversations were beginning, tentative exchanges that were slowly building bridges across the divide of war. Late November brought word of an approaching American holiday called Thanksgiving. Lieutenant Coleman gathered the women to explain the tradition through Private Cooper's translation. It was a day of gratitude, she told them, when Americans gathered with family to share an abundant meal and give thanks for their blessings. This year, the holiday fell on November 23rd, and Captain Hayes had authorized a special celebration that would include the prisoners. The German women listened with polite confusion. A holiday centered entirely around food and gratitude seemed almost absurd, given the context of war and captivity. Frida voiced the question many were thinking: "Why would you celebrate with us? We are your enemies." Rachel considered her response carefully before answering. "The holiday isn't about politics or war. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and the things we're grateful for, even in difficult times." The days leading up to Thanksgiving transformed the compound. Sergeant Sullivan threw himself into preparations with an enthusiasm that surprised even the regular staff. He requisitioned extra supplies, planned an elaborate menu, and recruited every available person to help with preparations. Annalise, now recovered from her ankle injury, found herself at the center of the kitchen work, learning to prepare dishes she had never heard of. Sweet potato casserole, cranberry sauce, cornbread stuffing, and pumpkin pie. Helen O'Brien became an unofficial cultural ambassador, explaining each dish's significance with animated gestures and patient repetition. The massive turkey, a bird so large that Annalise initially mistook it for some exotic American animal, became the centerpiece of fascination. Sullivan demonstrated how to prepare it, showing the women how to season and stuff the enormous bird. Kat, assigned to help with inventory, marveled at the sheer quantity of ingredients required. Butter measured in pounds, not ounces, sugar by the cupful, cream without ration cards or restrictions. Johanna watched the preparations from the infirmary, where she was treating a guard's minor cut. Corporal Walsh had injured her hand on a piece of equipment and had come to Johanna rather than waiting for the regular nurse. It was a small gesture of trust, but Johanna recognized its significance. As she cleaned and bandaged the wound, Betty spoke in slow, simple English that Johanna could mostly understand. "Tomorrow will be good. You'll see. It's about being together, being grateful we're alive." Thanksgiving morning arrived with clear skies and unusually warm temperatures. The mess hall had been transformed. Tables were arranged in a large square so everyone could see each other. Someone had found white tablecloths and autumn decorations, corn stalks and gourds that added unexpected festivity to the utilitarian space. When the prisoners arrived for the meal, they found the American staff already seated, waiting for them not as guards but as fellow diners. Captain Hayes stood to address the gathering, his words translated by Private Cooper. "Today we set aside our roles as captor and captive. Today we are simply people sharing a meal and acknowledging that even in wartime, we have things to be grateful for. We're grateful for peace, even though we're at war. We're grateful for full plates when others are hungry, and we're grateful that we can share this with all of you." The words hung in the air, met with uncertain silence from the German women who weren't quite sure how to respond to such unexpected sentiment. The Thanksgiving meal began with the presentation of the turkey, golden and glistening, carved by Sergeant Sullivan with ceremonial care. The German women watched in continued amazement as platters were passed around the tables, each one heaped with food that seemed to defy the reality of wartime rationing. sweet potatoes topped with melted marshmallows, a combination that struck the German women as bizarre until they tasted the surprising harmony of flavors, green bean casserole, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, cranberry sauce both jellied and whole berry, cornbread stuffing fragrant with sage and herbs. As the meal progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The formal distance that had characterized most interactions between guards and prisoners softened and eventually dissolved. Corporal Walsh found herself sitting between Johanna and Kat, attempting to explain the origins of Thanksgiving through a combination of simple English, hand gestures, and Private Cooper's assistance. The story of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a harvest feast resonated with the irony of their current situation, enemies breaking bread together in a strange echo of that distant historical moment. Sergeant Sullivan moved around the tables, ensuring everyone had enough food, his natural hospitality overriding any consciousness of rank or nationality. He noticed that Frida had barely touched her sweet potato casserole and paused to encourage her through gestures to try it. She did, reluctantly, and her eyebrows rose in surprise at the unexpected sweetness. Sullivan grinned, and for the first time since her capture, Frida found herself almost smiling back at an American soldier. Helen O'Brien began teaching the German women English names for the foods they were eating, turning the meal into an impromptu language lesson. "Turkey," she would say, pointing to the meat. The women repeated it in chorus, their accents heavy, but their attempts genuine. Turkey, then stuffing, gravy, cranberries. Each word was a small bridge being built across the linguistic divide. Annalise proved particularly adept, her young mind soaking up vocabulary with enthusiasm. Kat found herself explaining German holiday traditions to Corporal Thomas Wilson, who sat across from her with genuine curiosity in his eyes. She described Christmas markets, stolen bread, and the celebration of St. Nicolaus. Wilson listened intently, asking questions that showed real interest rather than mere politeness. He told her about Christmas on his family's Iowa farm, the similarities between their rural traditions creating unexpected common ground. Lieutenant Coleman observed the scene with mixed emotions. This was exactly what she had hoped for when she had pushed Captain Hayes to authorize the celebration, yet she also felt the weight of what it represented. These women were still prisoners. America was still at war with their country. The ease developing between captors and captives could complicate the clear lines that were supposed to exist. But watching Johanna laugh at something Betty Walsh had said, seeing young Annalise's face light up as she successfully pronounced pumpkin pie, Rachel couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. As dessert was served, pumpkin pie with fresh whipped cream, the conversation around the tables had evolved into something that resembled friendship more than the careful courtesy of earlier weeks. The women were learning that Americans could be generous, without ulterior motives, that kindness didn't require agreement on politics or war, that shared humanity could exist even between enemies. The days following Thanksgiving brought an unexpected heaviness to the barracks. The German women had experienced something beautiful and confusing, and now they struggled to reconcile their gratitude with the guilt that accompanied it. Johanna lay awake at night, thinking about her sister in Berlin, her family surviving on meager rations while she ate turkey and pie. The comfort of a full stomach had become complicated by the knowledge of those still suffering. Kat voiced what many were feeling during a quiet evening in the barracks. How can we accept their kindness when our people are starving, when our soldiers are dying? Her voice carried an edge of anguish that resonated through the room. Several women nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the same internal conflict. They had not asked to be captured. They had not asked for this abundance. Yet they received it daily. And with each meal, the guilt grew heavier. Frida, pragmatic as always, offered a different perspective. Would it honor our families to refuse food? Would it help Germany if we starved ourselves out of principle? She paused, letting her words settle. We are alive. We are being treated with dignity. Perhaps that is something to be grateful for, even if it feels wrong. Her logic was sound, but logic did little to ease the emotional weight they carried. Young Annalise had stopped writing letters home altogether. She couldn't bear the thought of her mother reading about the meals she ate while the family survived on turnips and black bread. The disconnect between her reality and theirs felt like a betrayal, even though she had no control over either situation. She threw herself into kitchen work with increased intensity, as if exhausting herself physically might somehow atone for the comfort she received. Lieutenant Coleman noticed the change in atmosphere and brought her concerns to Sergeant Sullivan. They stood outside the mess hall one evening, discussing the complex psychology of their situation. "They're feeling guilty about being well-fed," Rachel observed. "It's making them withdraw again, putting distance between themselves and the staff." Sullivan nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "Can't say I blame them. If I was captured and the enemy fed me better than my own people, I'd be torn up about it too." The tension came to a head one evening when Margaretty Fisher, a prisoner who had been mostly silent since arrival, refused her dinner. She sat at the table with her arms crossed, tears streaming down her face. "I can't," she said in broken English. "My husband, my children, they have nothing, nothing. And I sit here with meat and butter like a queen. It's not right. It's not right." Her voice rose with each word until she was nearly shouting. Johanna moved to sit beside Margaretty, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She spoke in German, her voice soft but firm. "Your suffering won't feed your children. Your starvation won't end the war. We are prisoners, yes, but we are also human beings who need to survive. When this is over, when we can go home, they will need us to be strong enough to help rebuild." The words were as much for herself as for Margaretty, an attempt to make peace with the impossible situation they found themselves in. March 1945 arrived with wildflowers blooming across the Arizona desert, transforming the landscape into unexpected beauty. The war in Europe was clearly entering its final phase, though news remained fragmentary and censored. The German women could sense the end approaching through the subtle changes in their captors' demeanor, the increased radio traffic, the tension that accompanied each new bulletin from the front. In the months since Thanksgiving, the dynamics in the compound had evolved into something none of them could have predicted. Johanna now worked daily in the infirmary alongside the regular nurse, treating minor injuries and illnesses for both prisoners and staff with equal care. Her English had improved dramatically through constant practice, and she found herself serving as an informal translator and mediator between the two groups. The role gave her purpose beyond mere survival. Kat had discovered an unexpected talent for administrative work. She helped organize supply inventories, managed work schedules, and even assisted with some of the paperwork that kept the compound running. Lieutenant Coleman had come to rely on her efficiency and attention to detail, a trust that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Kat found satisfaction in the work, in being useful rather than simply existing in captivity. Young Annalise had blossomed under Sergeant Sullivan's patient mentorship in the kitchen. She had learned to prepare dozens of American dishes and had even begun teaching Helen O'Brien some traditional Bavarian recipes, adapting them to available ingredients. The kitchen had become a space of genuine collaboration, where nationality mattered less than the shared goal of creating good meals. Sullivan had started calling her Annie, an Americanization of her name that she found herself accepting without protest. The Sunday pot roast tradition had continued unbroken throughout the winter, becoming a ritual that marked the passage of time and provided comfort through its predictability. But it was no longer just about the food. The Sunday meals had evolved into extended gatherings where guards and prisoners lingered over coffee, sharing stories and photographs, teaching each other songs and phrases in their respective languages. The boundaries between captor and captive had blurred into something more complex and more human. Spring also brought new challenges. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, reports filtered back about the conditions they were discovering. The stories of concentration camps, of systematic atrocities, of horrors that defied comprehension, reached even the isolated desert compound. Lieutenant Coleman made the difficult decision to share some of this information with the prisoners, knowing it would shatter whatever remaining illusions they held about their homeland's conduct during the war. The evening she gathered the women to share the news. Rachel saw the range of reactions she had expected: disbelief, denial, horror, shame. Some women wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. Frida's face went pale as she listened to the translated accounts from places like Dachau and Buchenwald. "We didn't know," she whispered. "How could we not have known?" But even as she said it, some part of her recognized the willful blindness that had allowed such things to happen. They had all seen signs, heard whispers, chosen not to look too closely at uncomfortable truths. Johanna felt something break inside her as she listened. The neat categories she had used to organize the world, the certainties she had clung to about serving a just cause, all of it crumbled. That night, she understood finally and completely why the Americans had shown them such unexpected kindness. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came through the radio in the mess hall, and the American staff erupted in celebration. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. For the German women prisoners, the news brought a complicated mixture of relief that the killing had stopped and despair at what surrender meant for their defeated homeland. They sat quietly while their captors celebrated, feeling the weight of national humiliation settle over them like a heavy blanket. Lieutenant Coleman gave her staff the day to celebrate before calling a meeting to discuss what came next. The question of repatriation loomed large and urgent. These women were prisoners of war, and with the war ended, they would need to be returned to Germany. But what Germany would they be returning to? Reports painted a picture of devastation, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, food supplies critically short, and a population displaced and traumatized by total defeat. 3 days after VE Day, Rachel gathered the prisoners to explain their options. Through Private Cooper's careful translation, she outlined the process ahead. They would be held until transportation could be arranged, likely several weeks or months, given the logistical challenges of moving thousands of prisoners across the Atlantic. They would be repatriated to Germany and released to make their own way in whatever remained of their homeland. She paused before adding the final, unprecedented option that Captain Hayes had authorized after lengthy discussions with higher command. "There is another possibility," Rachel continued, her voice careful and measured. "Given your excellent conduct during captivity, given the skills many of you have demonstrated, the United States government is prepared to offer a small number of you the opportunity to apply for permission to remain in America as immigrants. This is highly unusual, perhaps unprecedented, but these are unusual circumstances." The translation of her words fell into stunned silence. The German women looked at each other with expressions ranging from confusion to hope to fear. Johanna felt her heart racing. Stay in America? Build a new life in the country that had been her enemy? Leave behind everything and everyone she had known? But what was there to return to? Her grandmother was dead, her sister struggling to survive in a destroyed Berlin, her city in ruins, and here she had purpose, had work she valued, had built relationships with people who treated her with respect and dignity. The choice seemed impossible, yet it demanded to be made. Kat's analytical mind immediately began calculating possibilities and risks. She had no close family remaining in Munich. Her parents had died in an air raid in 1943. Her brother had been killed on the Eastern Front. What awaited her in Germany but rubble and memories? Yet how could she choose to stay in the land of her captors, to abandon her country in its moment of greatest need? The practical answer warred with her sense of duty and identity. Frida spoke first, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "How long do we have to decide?" Rachel understood the weight of the question. 2 weeks, she answered. 2 weeks to decide the rest of your lives." The women filed out of the mess hall in silence, each carrying the burden of an impossible choice. The 2 weeks that followed VE Day stretched like an eternity. The compound existed in a strange liminal space, no longer quite a prison but not yet something else. The American staff continued their duties with the same professionalism, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone understood that endings were approaching, that the strange community they had built together would soon dissolve, one way or another. Johanna spent long hours walking the perimeter of the compound, wrestling with her decision. She thought about her sister Liesel, alone in ruined Berlin, waiting for news of Johanna's return. How could she abandon her only living family? But the letters she had received, smuggled through Red Cross channels, painted a bleak picture. Liesel encouraged her to stay if the opportunity arose. "There is nothing left here for you but hunger and rubble," her sister had written in shaky handwriting. "If you have a chance for a better life, take it. I will survive. I am stronger than you think." Young Annalise made her decision quickly and with surprising certainty. She would stay. Her family's farm had been in the path of the Soviet advance, and she had received word through official channels that her parents and younger siblings had fled west, their current location unknown. Sergeant Sullivan had offered to help her find work, had even suggested she might continue training as a chef. The prospect of building something new felt better than returning to search for fragments of what had been lost. Kat struggled more visibly with the choice. She sat with Johanna one evening, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her face drawn with exhaustion from sleepless nights. "If I stay, I'm a traitor," she said quietly. "If I go back, I'm returning to nothing. Either way, I lose." Johanna had no answer for her, no wisdom that could make the choice easier. She simply sat beside her friend, offering the comfort of shared uncertainty. Frida announced her decision to return to Germany. She was the oldest among them, the most rooted in her identity as German despite everything that identity now meant. "I need to see what remains," she told the others. "I need to face what we became, what we allowed to happen. Running away to America feels like escaping justice." Her words carried no judgment of those who chose differently, only an articulation of her own moral compass and sense of duty. Lieutenant Coleman watched the women struggle with their decisions and felt the weight of the responsibility she carried. She had helped create the conditions that made staying even thinkable, had fostered the relationships that made leaving painful. In quiet moments, she wondered if offering this choice had been kindness or cruelty. Captain Hayes assured her they were simply giving the women options that circumstances had created, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they had fundamentally altered these women's lives in ways that went far beyond conventional prisoner treatment. By the end of the 2 weeks, the numbers were clear. Of the 23 German women prisoners, 7 had chosen to apply for permission to remain in America, 16 would return to Germany. The applications would require approval from multiple government agencies, a process that would take additional months, but the initial choices had been made. August 1945 brought the official orders for repatriation. The transport ships were ready, the paperwork completed, the logistics finally arranged. The 16 women who had chosen to return to Germany prepared for departure with mixed emotions. They packed their few belongings, exchanged addresses with those staying behind, and tried to ignore the anxiety that came with facing an unknown future in a devastated homeland. The morning of departure arrived with clear skies and already rising heat. The entire compound gathered outside the barracks where the transport trucks waited. Frida stood at the front of the group returning to Germany, her posture military straight despite the tears she was fighting to contain. She had spent the previous evening writing detailed instructions for those staying, practical advice about navigating American bureaucracy and cultural expectations, as if organizing information could somehow maintain connection across the distance that would soon separate them. Johanna had made her final decision to stay only 3 days earlier, after receiving a second letter from her sister explicitly releasing her from any obligation to return. Standing now with the small group remaining in America, she felt simultaneously liberated and guilty, hopeful and terrified. Beside her stood Annalise, Kat, and 4 others who had chosen to build new lives in this strange land that had fed them when they were hungry and shown them kindness when they expected only harshness. Sergeant Sullivan approached with a large basket, his weathered face showing unusual emotion. He handed it to Frida for the group, and she looked inside to find it packed with food for their journey. Sandwiches, fruit, cookies, and several canteens of water. "For the trip," he said simply through Private Cooper's translation. "So you don't go hungry." The gesture broke through Frida's composure, and tears finally fell as she accepted the basket and thanked him in her careful English. Lieutenant Coleman addressed both groups, her voice steady despite her own emotions. "To those returning to Germany, you carry with you our hope that you will help rebuild your country into something better than what it was. To those staying, you carry the responsibility of proving that enemies can become friends, that redemption is possible even after terrible wars." She paused, searching for adequate words. "All of you have shown courage and dignity in impossible circumstances. All of you have taught us something about humanity that we won't forget." The goodbyes were long and tearful. Frida embraced Johanna tightly, whispering in her ear, "Live well, make this choice mean something." Johanna nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Annalise clung to several of the women who had become like older sisters to her, promising to write, to remember, to honor their shared experience. Even Kat, usually so controlled, wept openly as she said farewell to friends she might never see again. Corporal Betty Walsh helped the departing women board the trucks, her own eyes red from crying. She had grown particularly close to several of them and felt the loss acutely. As the trucks pulled away, everyone stood watching until they disappeared from view, carrying 16 women back toward an uncertain future in a broken homeland. Those remaining turned slowly back toward the compound that would be their home for the foreseeable future, feeling the weight of their choice settling more heavily now that it was irrevocable. 20 years later, autumn 1965. Johanna Brenner Henderson stood in the kitchen of her small home in Tucson, Arizona, preparing Sunday pot roast. Her hands moved with practiced ease, seasoning the meat with the same care Sergeant Sullivan had taught her 2 decades earlier. Her husband David set the table while their 2 teenage children argued playfully about whose turn it was to make the gravy. The doorbell rang, and Johanna hurried to answer it, finding Annalise Sullivan on the doorstep. Annie, as everyone called her now, had married Sergeant Marcus Sullivan in 1947. She now ran her own catering business in Phoenix, her Bavarian-American fusion cuisine having become surprisingly popular. Behind Annie came Kat Weber Chen, who had built a successful career as a translator for the State Department. The 3 women embraced with the easy affection of family. The dinner table that evening held abundance as it always did. Pot roast tender enough to fall apart, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, vegetables prepared with care, and fresh bread still warm from the oven. But it also held something more precious than food. It held connection, memory, and the living proof that enemies could become friends, that prisoners could become citizens. As they ate, conversation turned to letters they had received from Germany. Frida wrote regularly, her correspondence maintaining the same organized precision it had held during captivity. She had helped rebuild Hamburg's administrative infrastructure, had married a widower with 3 children, and had found purpose in reconstruction. Several other women who had returned had also written over the years, their stories united by resilience and determination. Johanna's sister Liesel had visited twice, marveling at her sister's American life, while maintaining her own fierce pride in having survived and rebuilt in Berlin. The 2 women had made their peace with the distance between them, understanding that sometimes love meant accepting different paths rather than walking the same road together. After dinner, as was their tradition, the 3 women raised their coffee cups in a quiet toast, not to nations or politics or ideologies, but to a Sunday in October 1944 when they had first encountered pot roast and abundance, when they had first glimpsed the possibility that the world might be more complex and more hopeful than they had been taught. They toasted to Lieutenant Coleman, to Sergeant Sullivan, to Corporal Walsh, to all the Americans who had shown them that kindness was not weakness. The pot roast tradition continued, passed down to children who barely understood its significance, who grew up knowing only that Sunday dinners mattered, that gathering around abundant tables was how you built family and community. The story of the German women who couldn't believe so much meat had become a quiet legend, a reminder that even in war's darkest moments, humanity could prevail if people chose to see each other as human rather than merely as enemies. The plates were always full, the doors always open, and the memory of hunger transformed into gratitude for abundance and second chances.